CPS and CapX's last panel of conference, so I'm delighted that you're here. And it's also on, I think, the biggest question in politics, which is generational inequality. This is the real divide here. It's not north versus south, blue or red wall anymore. It is young versus old. And this is an existential question for the Conservatives, whose voters are getting older and older. I think there's a poll recently that showed only 1% of 18 to 24-year-olds plan to vote Conservative. So the real question we need to address today is what the Conservatives can do for young people to secure justice for the young. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by an amazing panel. So we have Tom Harwood, who's Deputy Political Editor of GB News, Liv Lever, who's the Director of Blue Beyond, Matthew Feeney, who is our Head of Digital and Technology and Innovation at the Centre for Policy Studies, and Miriam Cates MP. And I think I'm fairly confident in saying this is some of the youngest people here at conference to discuss this extremely important question. So Miriam, can we start with you?
Thank you, and it is a real pleasure to be here because young people and children is something I'm really passionate about, not just because politically we face an existential crisis if we don't manage to win back votes of the young, but also from a moral and economic and the future of our country point of view. And I think the premise of this panel was, is Britain becoming a gerontocracy? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And in all sorts of ways, we are constantly asking the young to make sacrifices for the old, and that is the wrong way around. And I think we've seen from COVID, where the young were asked to make unbelievable sacrifices for older people, that still making sacrifices, and the long tail of the impact on children and young people, I don't think we even fully understand now. Then, of course, the impact of inflation because of all the money printing, again, that's going to impact young people for a long time. So I think, unfortunately, I hate to start on a negative note, but economically, the future for the under 40s is looking very, very grim. And part of that is to do with the size and the longevity of the boomer generation. Now, we can't blame the boomer generation for being big and living a long time. It's a good thing. But, of course, the ratio of younger people paying taxes to older people needing pensions is now very unfavourable to the young, and of course that has put a huge financial tax burden on the young. We've failed to reform the NHS, so the NHS gets bigger and bigger every year, and of course most of the people using the healthcare are older people. Again, it's great that we've got it, but most of the people paying for it are the younger people. But really, the elephant in the room and the thing that we have to solve is housing. It's the number one thing that you want for a secure life, and the number one thing that indicates you'll vote Conservative. So it's clearly, it should be in our political interest to solve this problem as well. And we see how much this impacts on the lifestyle of the young. So now most young people have no hope of getting on the housing ladder, so they have to choose whether they want to live with their parents well into their late 20s and 30s, whether they want to spend a third of their income or more if you live in London on rent, money that essentially you're throwing away and you'll never get back. And the impact of never having that hope to own your own home is huge psychologically. It makes you not part of the capitalist society. It's also delaying people or stopping people at all from starting their own families. And whilst that might not be on the minds right now of everybody in the room, the research does show that most people do want to have children, and that actually some of these economic barriers are actively stopping people from having children. And we have seen, as a result of that, a falling birth rate. For the first time last year, the average woman in the UK at age 30 didn't have a child. That's never happened before in history. And of course, that might not be a problem in some ways, but in other ways, how is this generation going to have their pensions and healthcare paid for if the next generation is even smaller? So this generation really is squeezed in the middle. So I just want to, for a couple of minutes, just talk about the housing issue, because we often hear this is about supply and demand and why aren't we building more houses? I'm not actually convinced that this is principally a supply and demand problem. And the reason for that is that we have 26 million homes in England for 56 million people. That's approximately one dwelling for every two people. That's not really a shortage. There are some local shortages, absolutely, in certain parts of the London and South East. But I think what's happened is that ultra-low interest rates for a long period of time have generated an enormous money supply into the market, so of course that's pushed up prices. But it's also mean that people who have traditionally invested in stocks and shares or in long-term investments haven't been able to do that because they don't make a return, so they've invested in property instead. So now much of the demand for property comes from the asset rich, from international investors, from pension companies. So I don't think, however many houses you build, you're going to touch the prices. So I think we need a new market of building houses specifically for young people that are only available to young people and is separate from the main market. And I think that is the only way to do it because the market is totally broken. So if we fix housing, I think we've got a chance of having an economic future and a chance of people voting Conservative.
Thank you very much. Now, Matthew has actually edited an essay collection that is forthcoming, published by the CPS, entitled Justice for the Young. He's going to tell us a bit about some of the themes that have emerged from the research that we've produced.
Yes, I thought it was only fair that you can end this panel as depressed as I am, having edited this volume, which should be in your inbox in the coming weeks. We felt at CPS that there was a unique problem facing young people in this country, and we commissioned the research team at CPS, and we invited a few outside guests to write chapters on their respective areas of expertise. And I thought I would share with you some of the statistics and facts that I learned while editing this volume, explain to you a few of my own thoughts, and then probably leave you in a state of despair. So I want to begin with something that's already been alluded to as far as pensions and the issue facing young people. So in 1908, 65-year-olds plus made up 5% of the population. Today that figure's about 20%. On current trends, by 2026, there will be more people in this country older than 65 than younger than 18. And if you're very young, for example, only 65% of 11-year-olds left primary school in 2019 with the expected standards of reading, writing, and maths. Only 41% of pupils said they felt safe at school every day of the week. The typical British student graduates college or university with more debt than the average American student. I found this in a recent poll, a third of 16 to 35-year-olds in this country are considering leaving for a foreign country to live and work. And it was already alluded to housing, but this was an astonishing statistic. So today, only about 28% of 25 to 34-year-olds own their own home. In 1989, it was more than half at 51%. My own issue that I work on is technology and innovation, and in my chapter I talk a lot about relative technological stagnation. The economist Tyler Cowen years ago talked about the great stagnation that's been happening since the 1970s, but I think is affecting young people in a number of ways. There's been what people have called a revolution of bits, not atoms, and I think a lot of young people these days have lived through some technological changes, but nothing like what our parents and grandparents lived through. If you were born in 1900 and died in 1980, you died in a completely different world to the one that you were born in. You lived through the emergence and widespread use of the radio, the telephone. It was 800 months between the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk to man walking on the moon. You came through the development of the computer. It's just unimaginable. But if you were born 20 years ago, in 2003, you've had a few new apps to look forward to. The next big thing on technology headlines has all been about software. You know, where's my flying car? You know, where is my Mars colony? You know, there is, and I mention that because I think we don't really understand or appreciate what it's like to have a generation of voters who have not lived through either significant economic growth or technological innovation. These are features of the last century that unfortunately have just been left behind for a lot of young people, and we don't appreciate, I think, enough what that will do to politics and what young people demand. One of the most important facts that was highlighted by my colleague Carl Williams was that if you exclude the COVID years, so the boom from the pandemic, GDP growth has reached or exceeded 3% in only 2 of the last 20 years. If we think about if you're 20, you mentioned how few young people are willing to vote Tory. Let's think about the person I mentioned a few minutes ago. If you were born in 2003, you're 20 years old now, You were born in the wake of 9/11. You were born the same year that the coalition invaded Iraq. You were a child when the financial crisis emerged, and your political awakening might have been the coalition government. And I don't know what, after all that time, if there's much to promise. For young people at least, the young people are being asked to pay almost unimaginable amount of money for the elderly who are very politically active, and they are going to continue to vote. I'll conclude my remarks there. I'll just say, look, yeah, winter is coming, and there is no wall. It's nice to hear that there are ideas on the edges. Throughout conference, I've heard a lot of interesting proposals specifically related to childcare, to education. But I think once you appreciate the scale of the amount of money that's been promised to future generations and current retirees, you can only come to the conclusion that the fiscal sanity is going to require immense and imaginative cuts. So with that, happy to turn back to Alys.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Liv?
Yes, so I'm Olivia and I'm Director of Blue Beyond, and we are a think tank for young conservatives. We're not affiliated to the party, but our whole essence is about getting young people involved into politics who are conservative, but don't necessarily come from backgrounds where they find it easy to access politics for a whole variety of reasons. For example, they may be social, educational, financial, and obviously if you live in the depths of Middlesbrough, or you're even based in the Highlands in Scotland, you know, you're going to find it very hard to input into policy making. That happens in Westminster and all the political cogs in the machine that happen. So, and our focus really, we're kind of split into two ways. Part of it is policy, and a part of that what we look at so far is housing, being the big one of our member concerns, but also mental health and how our members deal with the NHS and navigating all those practicalities and challenges, because obviously mental health is a massive thing for young people, but they're paying so much into an NHS system but actually really struggling to get anything out of that. And then another thing that we do really, in which is kind of what our bread and butter is, and kind of what we really got into when we started in 2019, is that what our opportunities are out there. For example, we have a fantastic women's engagement project. You know, what the challenges that women face getting into politics, and you know, there are challenges there where we lose a lot of talent because they're so put off by so many things. But also, like, we really care about the sustainability of our party. I always use the Jamie Oliver narrative, the Jamie Oliver analogy of he took away the turkey twizzlers for millennials, so that meant that when he then opened his restaurants, nobody actually wanted to go in and buy his food, and he went bust. And I think the Conservative Party is heading in the same way with not just members and potential candidates, but voters. And you know, if you're a young person that's conservative and you don't want to vote, you're not going to go out and leaflet. You're not going to go out and join your local association and then potentially become a candidate. And through that, we're losing so much talent. We're losing the next generation of Miriams, of fantastic people like Lucy Fraser, and even those like Rishi Sunak, who come from those backgrounds where their voices are not necessarily where Rishi's concerned, is very rich, but but certainly, you know, there's a huge talent problem, and you know, we estimate that probably in the next 5 years we're going to start to see this become a problem, but it maybe in the next 10 it's going to start to become a massive problem. And for me, the thing is that you can have all these wonderful policies, you can put all these ideas and you can float them and you can write your research papers, and that's fantastic. But ultimately, if the party is not communicating with younger people on how that will affect them and how that will benefit them, then it's going to be ineffective and pointless, to be honest. So, you know, it's like you don't set up a business and then don't go and advertise and market your product. They need to get the communications right, they need to get the engagement right, to make sure that young people are inputting, and also it's awareness. We speak to and we hear a lot of MPs say, you know, either that they feel that young people are fantastic, but really in the practicalities, that's just not happening, and we know that. So, and we are the only group as well to poll young conservatives out there. So we are the only group to poll members that are under 30, and we had to have a set of housing polling early in the year, and you know, 72% of our members said that young people had not been in mind when policies were made when it came to housing in the last 10 years. And currently, you know, we've got polling in the field that is a temperature check of the party, you know, what are our members feeling about the current state of things, and basically 90% of them have said that they do not feel that policy across the board has young people in mind, you know, they really, really need to be heard. So those are my comments, probably not the techie policy that quite Miriam and yourself have gone into, but you know, it is going to be a problem, and ultimately I think most of the rooms sat here today are not going to be keen on a Labour government or a Lib Dem coalition. So
Absolutely not.
for now or the future.
Thanks very much, Liv. And Tom?
Yeah. I read earlier today that the average age at which one now starts to vote Conservative is 47. The only thing that shocked me about that is how young it was. I thought it was a bit older, but perhaps a more incisive number is the one, Alys, that you brought up at the start of this discussion. 1% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting Conservative. 1%. What poll delivers 1%? There's a term in polling called the lizard man's constant. It's about 4%. It's the proportion of UKIP voters who voted Remain. It's the proportion of Obama voters who believe he's a lizard. It's basically the level at which you get fuzzy joke results. So to get a result below 4% is really blooming stark. I'm censoring my language. But why is that? Why is that? I think at the heart of this, there's been a profound incoherence at the heart of Conservative policy over the last 13 years. There has been principled and indeed, some might argue, very well delivered free market reform and indeed spending reduction for anyone under the age of 65. And yet for those over the age of 65, we've seen a version of socialism delivered. We've seen ring-fenced departments. Health spending between 2010 and 2023 has risen by 40%. This is inflation adjusted, £130 billion a year in 2010, £180 billion a year this year. That's a £50 billion rise each year. That's not £350 million a week, that's closer to £1 billion a week extra being spent on our healthcare. And pensions. Pensions at a time when wages were reducing compared to inflation, they rose by double digits. From one side of the Prime Minister's mouth, he says that we've got to constrain public sector wage rises because we can't be printing this money to chase inflation and have cost push inflation and have wage push inflation. On the other hand, he's giving double-digit inflation-busting pay rises to pensioners. How is that coherent policy? Now, you could argue that it's wise policy electorally, but it certainly isn't coherent. And then perhaps the most pernicious of all of the areas that have been ring-fenced has been ring-fencing asset values, the value of people's homes, not just ring-fenced, but inflated. And yes, I completely agree with Miriam, I think interest rates are a part of this, but I don't think they tell the whole picture. Because there's the same interest rates in London as there are in Sunderland. But Sunderland house prices have risen to a lesser extent than London house prices have. Demand to live in London is significantly higher than demand to live in Sunderland. And that feeds into the fundamental issue here, which is demand and supply. Interest rates play a part, demand and supply. Without it, you don't get the fundamental difference. And you look to places like Auckland in New Zealand, which has recently delivered upzoning reform. The house prices in Auckland, compared to other New Zealand cities, have fallen relative to relative to wages, whereas other cities have risen. You look at what Houston has done in Texas, and you compare it to the Bay Area in California, and you can see the difference that policy changes, that making it easier to build, delivers when it comes to houses. But clearly, what the Conservative Party has done here is look at the short-term electoral interest over the long-term interest of the country. It's an irony, it's a profound, sad, depressing irony that on the front of this conference we have the slogan, long-term decision-making for a brighter future. I would ask the Prime Minister, where has the long-term decision-making been when it comes to housing policy? Where has the long-term decision-making been when it comes to the demographic crisis that we are hurtling towards, that we heard those statistics earlier? It's profoundly concerning, and I hear on the grapevine that tomorrow the Prime Minister will announce even more, perhaps I would go so far as to say ageist policy. A ban on smoking rising incrementally year by year, so people born after the year 2005 will never be allowed to buy a cigarette. This from a man who describes himself as the next Margaret Thatcher. It doesn't sound particularly classically liberal to me. And the other big rabbit we're expecting from the hat from the Prime Minister's speech tomorrow, a ban on disposable vaping, sucking the fun from anyone under the age of 30. What else have we seen? A ban on NOS canisters, no more dangerous than inhaling a helium balloon, and yet completely banned by this government. It seems this government likes to ban things and tax things when it comes to young people. What have we seen? We've seen income tax rises for people in work. But what have we seen when it comes to assets? We've seen asset price inflation and not a reorganisation in terms of where the taxation falls. It seems that policy has been directed profoundly towards the group that vote and away from the group that do not vote. And that's where I conclude. This isn't rocket science. There's a reason why the Conservative Party has been pursuing this course, and it's won them, more or less, 4 election victories. In fact, the one election that it didn't quite win them was because there was going to be a reorganisation of who pays for elderly social care. Should it be those who have assets, or should it be the taxpayer in general? Well, the electorate answered the question. So I think, to conclude, if we're going to start to talk about how we change the Conservative Party, we've also got to think about how to change minds in the country, or find smarter solutions that don't present these stark electoral choices, because it's so clear to see why they've been made.
Thanks very much, Tom. Miriam, you'll have been on the horns of this dilemma as a Conservative MP. You know that it is older people who tend to vote Conservative, and yet you know that in the national interest, you need to do more things for young people. I used to work for an MP in the southeast. You know, she understood how difficult it was for young people in her constituency to buy a home, that the parents knew that their kids wouldn't be able to live in the same street as them, and yet whenever a housing development was proposed, she would have to oppose it because those were the people who voted for her. How do Tory MPs resolve this dilemma?
Well, it's a good question, and you could argue about compulsory voting or something like that. If you knew that every single person had to vote, I think that would. I'm not arguing for compulsory voting, just to make clear, but that is an interesting idea, because then then everybody does get a vote, and I think you very quickly see more policies for young people. But if we're going to talk about Thatcher, she was brave, and she did things that were unpopular, and I think people are more altruistic than we give them credit for. And you're right, older people do want good things for their children and young and grandchildren, and if you can sell them that vision, then I think they will be altruistic enough to vote for it. And I think also, as politicians, we don't do a very good job of explaining things sometimes, and we also don't credit the electorate with being as intelligent as they really are. So, for example, we talk about pensions. Only 1 in 3 pensioners has paid enough into the system to get the money out that they're getting in pensions and the NHS, and yet the public believes, because we haven't told them otherwise, that all these people claiming pensions are just taking out what they put in. It doesn't work like that. There is no great savings bank of the government. Young people are paying taxes, and that is paying pensions. And I think if we explain that to people, that actually the state pension is unmeans tested, unlike things that young people are going to get, childcare, you only get that in a particular form, which is state childcare, particular hours of the day, a particular price. It'd be like saying you can have your state pension in Morrison's vouchers, tough if you want to shop at Asda. But it is this inequality, but we just don't explain it. And I think if we explained to people just how bad this inequality is and just how generous the state pension is, then we would see a shift. But ultimately, we've got to be brave. We've got to challenge things like the triple lock. We've got to challenge the narrative around housing, and we've got to almost have faith that the older generation will be inspired by that for their own children and grandchildren. But, ultimately, we've got to make that choice, because even if it means we're out of power for some time, the long-term prospects are much better if we promise good things for the young. So I think we've just got to be brave, but explain it well.
Ditch the triple lock?
I personally would advocate for that because I think there's a strong argument for it going up with inflation because, of course, people on pensions are on fixed incomes, but I don't really see why it should be tied to anything else.
Hear, hear. Liv, the unusual young people that you talk to who are conservative, what is it that inspires them?
I think, so a lot of my members joined probably around the Brexit period, and I think that one thing that we're noticing now is that Brexit did distort a lot of what our politics is, and that it just basically bulldozed a lot of other stuff to then talk about. And to be honest, what my members want is that it was like what Tom was saying, you know, there's all these kind of like penalising, really pro-nanny state policies for young people. And I've got we don't sit on one ideological end of the party. We represent all corners of the party, from the dripping wets to the more Brexit party voting young conservatives. So, you know, when we asked our members, like, what policies do you want to see going forwards towards the general election that's probably going to come straight around the corner? You know, 45% said, like, scrap income tax. 45% of them said, let's scrap the triple lock. And a big chunk of them said other, like, really quite fiscally conservative policies, like scrapping the licence fee, which we have to pay, which is disgusting. And it really does penalise young people because there's no form of exemption if you are young, and it's so expensive. You know, and a lot of our members also prefer, you know, to scale back or certainly scrap a lot of sin taxes that we have out there, because ultimately, you know, it is costing them more money. And I think a lot of our young conservatives are young conservatives because they believe in personal responsibility. They believe in, you know, the importance of family and business and growth and all of these things that makes everybody else conservative. It's not necessarily massively different just because you're under 45. And the problem, I think, now is the fact that you're losing so much interest. And so many people have come to me this conference and said, there's not as many young people here this year. Why is there not droves of university societies here in their ties and their pin badges and you know we're certainly, I think there's a lot less suits and lots less suits news articles out there this year as well, because they're just not here. But the quite sinister fact of this is the fact that when they look at the numbers, you know, it's either come to conference where it's extremely expensive, the accommodation around here is quite dear, the ticket price in itself, whilst it's a lot cheaper than probably a lot of this panel have paid, you know, it's still a lot of money. So they do have to look at the numbers and sit there and say, well, I just can't come. And the problem is that we're losing interest, we're losing gain. And whilst, yes, they are fundamentally believing in all these things, the policies are just pushing them so far away, because it's not as simple as all these culture war gimmicky things that are being said by Suella Braverman, by Steve Baker about trans people. It's the fact that they're simply struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads.
So I'm interested that you mentioned culture warriors, because I think there's a kind of stereotype of young people as being very like woke and caring a lot about these kind of identity issues. Do you think that holds true, or do you think that there's another vision that could inspire young people?
I think no, it doesn't actually. I think the problem is that the left has always been better at communicating. They're always so much better in the media space. They're always so much better at screaming louder about us than some people. We have some members that are extremely passionate about, for example, trans rights. We have some members that are extremely passionate about the importance of family and having children and childcare and all these kind of bits of social policy, you know, woke culture type of things. And certainly those of us that sit on university campuses and are quite literally being targeted and penalised because of their views, and they don't feel like they can be themselves. But ultimately, I think at the minute, whilst yes, it's what they care about, but because the fact that, you know, it's when you go to the supermarket and you look at a price of bread, you could look at the price of a loaf of bread and it's 10p more expensive than what it was when you bought it last week, and that's me probably being conservative with the figures. You know, that's what matters to them. So yes, they do care, but at the minute, the fact of the matter is that payment of rent, the food that you put on the table is a lot more important.
It was rather interesting coming back to England after 10 years in Washington, because I observed this, what people call the sort of woke cultural war issue seems to be another American export. And I remember sitting in Washington, D.C. and seeing footage of a London Black Lives Matter protest and seeing all these protesters surrounded by unarmed police saying, you know, hands up, don't shoot. And I thought it was very interesting that there is, and what's frustrating though, I think, is that in the 1980s, if you were tasked with asking someone at random one policy question to determine their politics, you would have probably asked them an economic question. You would have said, well, ask them, do you believe the minimum wage should go up or down? Do businesses need to be more or less regulated? Something like that. I don't think today if you ask someone, you have one policy question to ask someone to determine their politics, they would pick actually much to do with economics. I think they'd probably ask about this culture war stuff. And the problem is, I think, that a political party that sees support dwindling or election loss on the horizon views these kind of culture war battles as low-hanging fruit. And because I did some work on the online safety bill, I observe in the discussion about woke cultural issues and regulation on the internet, say, a very disturbing lack of faith in the institutions between the individual and the state. There is, if you observe a problem with an individual or with a collection of individuals, just reach for regulation and legislation. There is it seems to me, a very distressing lack of faith in the family, in religious institutions, in charities, in academia. And when they see issues in academia, what's the response from conservative MPs? Well, we should regulate them to say that they can't do certain things. So I think while I think it's an interesting cultural observation that there has been this embrace of culture war battles, I personally would be hesitant to embrace it as a winning political philosophy for the long term.
What do you say to that, Tom? GB News obviously gives a voice to perhaps the other side of the culture war. Do you think that that's an election-winning strategy to double down on cultural issues, or?
I think that politicians run into a trap when they describe young voters as woke, particularly because I've got incontrovertible proof that young voters are not woke. No one knows what woke means. You look at all of the polling on this. Some people will say it just means not being racist. Other people will say it means cancelling everyone over the age of 35. It's not a word that has broad agreement or understanding, and it actually provides a barrier between nerds who attend party conferences, like everyone in this room, and normal, ordinary people who aren't particularly political. It was about 7 years ago that I was involved in student politics slightly too deeply. And the reason I kept winning student elections, despite not being a flavour of Marxist-Leninist, was because I didn't talk too much about politics. Frankly, I took the piss. And the most amazing way that you can win student elections, or that you can talk to normal people who are young voters or could be young voters, is by ruthlessly going after the people who are oh so pious and serious and dull. Because I think that might be, if there is a sort of way to define or get to the heart of what we might describe as wokeness, and I don't like using that word, perhaps political correctness. Maybe I'm just too old-fashioned. Should we just go back to political correctness? Because it is a sense of sort of holier-than-thou, puritanical thought that nothing else can be let in. And that's deeply boring. Not many young people want to be told that they can't do this or can't do that, or they just want to go out and get drunk. The people that would get behind student union campaigns to shut things down or close things up are the same sort of people who would have marched on Parliament trying to ban Christmas in the 1600s. There's no difference between these people, and I think if Conservatives are to speak in more normal, human language, removing the peculiar idea that people who turn up on wet Wednesday evenings to talk about Karl Marx are in any way representative of ordinary young people in this country. They're not.
Miriam, pick up up on Matthew's point about this urge to kind of constantly regulate or ban things in order to protect young people. He was talking about it in the context of the online safety bill, but I think if we're seeing this smoking ban as well, how can you tackle that urge from inside the Conservative Party?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I would highly recommend a book by the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt called The Coddling of the American Mind. It's absolutely brilliant, and it explores cancel culture in universities, but it takes it back to the overprotection of children and young people by, probably my generation and the generation above. And so we protect children so much from physical risk and from failure in their childhood and teens that they are then genuinely fearful of conflict, of emotional distress when they leave home and go to university. And I think Tom's absolutely right. It is totally wrong for the older generation to call your age snowflakes and woke. Maybe some of you are, but if you are, it's our fault for over-coddling it, and we've become so insistent on no physical danger and no risk. My grandfather, who's now 90, he was a twin, and when he was 4 or 5, his parents used to kick him and his brother out the house in the morning at 9 o'clock, and they would wander around the village and the fields, and they'd come home for tea. Now, I know we have traffic and all those kind of other things, and I'm not saying that that's a responsible parent, but if you let your child go to the park now on their own, the other parents think you're really irresponsible. But the impact of that is that people become very fearful of any kind of risk or challenge, and this has been proven psychologically, and I think that's a big part of it. And so then the universities say, we've got all these young people with anxiety, we've got all these young people with mental health problems, what do? Oh, we better protect them from anything that might harm them further, and then the cycle repeats itself. And then the government buys into it and says, mental health, online safety. Now, I support not allowing children to see absolutely horrific material online. I mean, that's a basic feature of child safety. But we've got to help people to become more robust. But I think we're talking about justice for the young, and we're talking about essentially how we want to redistribute wealth from the old to the young. I'm all for that. But actually what we really want as Conservatives is to heal the generational divide. A Conservative is about transporting your heritage from the old to the young and for the next generation. And actually what we need to do is bring the generations back together and find, the meeting points, the points of synergy between the generations. And I think, that should be our focus really, because if we're actually just about redistribution, how are we different from socialists? We should be about having policies that suit the whole of society, where grandparents can enjoy it on behalf of their young people. And maybe things like, exploring extended family again. One of the reasons that our state is so enormous is because we don't look after our old people anymore. Now, if we looked after our own old people, we'd spend an awful lot less money on the NHS and social care. Perhaps that's a challenge to the young. But what we've got to do here is bring the generations back together. So I agree, no name calling from one generation to the other, but we've also got to make a lot more effort to understand where each generation's coming from.
I can one-up you on that in terms of symbiosis.
Yeah.
Not just greater intergenerational mixing to help look after older people, but also look after younger people.
Absolutely.
It's the childcare, of course, is I know one of your massive concerns, and the way that some other countries manage to do this is with greater involvement from grandparents.
Exactly. So that goes back to my point. Why can't? So the government set aside £4 billion for childcare, but you can only have it between 9 and 3, 38 weeks of the year in a formal setting that might not suit your requirements and you might not like. Why not distribute that money equally amongst people with families, like you do with pensions, and say, well, use it to pay grandma, use it to work less, use it to pool. That would be a Conservative way, because it's about choice, and that would do exactly that. Because I think sometimes we think about grandparents as rich and retired, but grandparents in my constituency are often still in the workplace, and they can't afford to give up work to look after grandchildren. But if they got paid £5 or £6 an hour to do it, they'd do it. Why don't we do those kind of intergenerational Conservative policies that would bring the generations together instead of creating these kind of culture wars, generational wars?
Yeah. I think coming on to Miriam's point about how young people are so unprepared when they leave and they go to university and they leave home, I think one of the massive gripes that comes out of our members is the fact that they lack core skills, that they feel so unprepared, because all that they were taught throughout the generations is, all they were taught was kind of like, you must get an A star to get onto the next educational step in the ladder, go on to university, go and get a good job, and that's how you're going to succeed. When actually, you know, our educational institution should be looking at the well-rounded individual that pops out at the end. And we're seeing this now when a lot of employers are moaning and saying that our young people are lazy, or they can't speak to people, or they won't pick up the phone. But the reality is that educational institutions have actually failed our young people, really, because they were so adamant the fact that they had to then sit there and get good grades. And, you know, and this does link on to then the older generations then calling us names. I know my dad certainly gets very frustrated, and when I ring him up, my colleagues and peers have the exact same thing. We weren't taught those core skills. And, you know, and it's, for example, it's the same thing with the pensions and the student loans, in the fact that we were never taught how to save. You were always, and you weren't even really taught properly on how your student loan worked, because A, they didn't really know that the policy had stayed the same because the government kept moving it around, but B, that also then meant that you had young people putting so much money at risk that now they've come out the other end of it, they're really in quite of a pickle.
Well, I think, just to pick up on the student loans, I think that's a really important thing we've got to tackle as well, because it's deeply unconservative to expect people to start their adult life in debt. Because firstly, it's not a proper debt in the sense that if you stop earning, you don't have to pay it back. Now, that's a bad way to think about debt, because if you take out a mortgage or a loan for a car, you're going to have to pay that back whatever happened. But secondly, it's so demoralising, and it encourages bad habits. If you're already in debt, what's another chai latte? What's another pint? You know, you're already in the red. And I think it's so wrong of the government to expect young people to start their lives in debt. Now, that doesn't mean I think everybody should get free higher education. Absolutely not. But what we should be doing is putting that, you know, £14 billion a year that we throw away almost on some university courses. Of course, some are brilliant and worthwhile. Give it in vouchers, so you can put that towards the training or university education of your choice. Combine it with employers, combine it with businesses. Start your life not only with skills, but with no debt. You know, what a boost that would be for young people.
I think we should be wary about calling it debt. And I think it's wrong that the government has done this at the first place. Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, says we should call it a graduate contribution scheme. Because it's 9% on top of your... It's tax. It's taxing the young and not taxing the old. And one of the most pernicious things, of course, with the extraordinarily high tax rates we do have in this country, is if you're a young person who's fortunate to get into, you know, a job that pays over £50,000 a year, if you're going off to be a lawyer, or perhaps you're one of those junior doctors who does a bit of private practice on the side but doesn't tell anyone when you go on TV to talk about it, then you're taxed at 49%. That's more than people working in the City of London are taxed. For people just out of university. And if you do very, very well indeed, although slightly less well than it would have been just last year, you'll be paying over 50% as a marginal rate of tax. And you can see how demoralising it is coming out of your PAYE forms. You can see the cash trickle out every time. And it just reminds you that you're so much less well off than someone who is in exactly the same position as you are, but happens to be a decade older. I think it's a really tricky policy conundrum, because you want to provide a sense that going to university should be a value-driven thing. Perhaps you should be dissuaded from doing courses that pile you with a huge amount of graduate contribution demand that aren't going to end you up in a particularly high-paying role. Perhaps university isn't the best place if that's your desired path to go into something more creative or arts-driven or whatever. But I think firstly there needs to be a deep, deep rebranding exercise in terms of what this system is called.
Absolutely. I'll take some questions from the audience here, and should we do two at a time? So do this gentleman here and this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. So I host a weekly radio show for young people, talk about news, current affairs, politics. One of the main issues we have is young people constantly messaging in, and the listenership's majority Gen Z, constantly saying, what is the point in staying here? We're facing a potential brain drain. My listenership is, as I say, majority Gen Z. If it's students in college, they're looking at university abroad. if they're students in university, they're looking at working in Australia, at least America. And in fact, on Tom's point at the start of this panel about the party conference slogan, we did a show from conference in which we asked, is the Conservative Party making these so-called long-term decisions for a brighter future? And for the listenership of that episode, only 21% said yes, 79% said no. So just on that point, how can the system be reformed to actually create the incentive for young people to want to stay here and not just join this larger potential brain drain? Thank you.
Another gentleman over here somewhere.
Thank you, Ben from Sheffield. I'm not convinced that fighting for the right for young people to get lung cancer is going to get them jumping on the Tory bandwagon. But on a serious note, where's the policy that connects young people with the workplace? They've got to be in education until they're 18.
Yeah.
I'm passionate about getting young adults into the workplace in Sheffield and the charitable work we do, and that's how you make it conservative. Showing someone, getting them to rub shoulders with private enterprise, getting them to spend time with a small business owner that's made a new way for himself and told a new story for him and his family. Where's the policy that is connecting education with the real world in that sense?
Who wants to take this? So we've got young people leaving and connecting young people with the workplace.
Look, I mean, it's hard. This is a high tax, low growth, low wage, low savings, debt addicted society. And I don't blame people for thinking that it might be worth having a look elsewhere. It sounds cliche, but I think it's going to take a lot of bold choices to make this look to look attractive. I work in the technology sector, tech policy, and the government is very, very keen oftentimes to talk about how many unicorns we have, how much tech investment we have, and we have a lot of great tech companies, but we're not home to a great tech industry, right? It's good we build tech companies until Asian or American companies come along to buy them. And if you have a lot of hope for the technology sector, keep in mind that's a very highly mobile workforce. If you can work on AI in London, chances are you can go to Boston, San Francisco, maybe even Tokyo, and to the continent into Berlin. So that is going to take a lot of bold choices. On education, look, I tried in my opening remarks to highlight the fiscal hole that is facing future governments, and I think education's a low-hanging fruit for getting the government out of the way, and we should probably let a lot of universities go bust, and we should stop the academic inflation that has been happening for years and years. Before getting into public policy, I worked in journalism, and 20, 30 years ago, you didn't need to have a university education to become a journalist. You would leave school and you would go to your local paper, you'd learn copy editing, you'd learn layout. And now there are, master's degrees in journalism, and you just think what? There is no need for this ratcheting academic inflation. So I think actually getting, and I say this as the son of an academic who grew up in a lot of academic fields, but there are probably a little too many of them. and getting academia out of, clogging up the education to workforce pipeline would be a good start.
I have to say I did a master's in journalism, but look at me
It's done
now,
you very well.
So,
Yeah.
anyone else want to pick up on that? I mean, I think this point about people emigrating, this is just an aside, I find it very frustrating when you get these GPs and NHS doctors boasting about going to Australia when the health service is on its knees. That's just a frustration of mine. But anyone else want to
Also,
pick up on that?
the same doctors who would oppose and do march with the BMA to oppose any tiny reform that is proposed to make the NHS slightly more efficient, want to fly off to countries where more than 25% of people have private healthcare. Want to fly off to Australia, whereby if you earn in the highest tax bracket, you get a tax punishment from the government if you don't take out private healthcare. And these are the people who are calling the Prime Minister immoral for having the audacity to, as someone of means, take pressure off the state system. But yeah, to turn to the original question, and thank you so much for saying Generation Z. I've had it up to here with Brits saying Generation Z. You're British. But to turn perhaps to Generation Zs, over in Texas, there's a chain of car washes called Buc-ee's. And I found this remarkable recruitment poster not that long ago, advertising for a manager of a single Buc-ee's store, a single Buc-ee's car wash in Texas. The salary advertised was $150,000 to $225,000 a year. Wow. Indeed, if you wanted to be an assistant manager to this one car wash, not the whole chain, just one car wash, you'd be on 100K a year. Now, of course, that's dollars, but it gives you an indication of where American salaries are compared to where British salaries are. And to think about the choices that American governments of various flavours have made in the post-war era compared to the choices that British governments of various flavours have made in the post-war era, perhaps it returns to this original idea. Margaret Thatcher did so many things to make this country profoundly better. She saw it as her mission to unwind what Clement Attlee did to this country, which in my view was almost destroy it. And she actually did a lot to reverse that decline, whether it was the nationalised industries or high levels of tax. But the one area that she did not touch was what Clement Attlee did to planning policy in this country. From 1948, you took away the right of an individual to build on their own land without consulting a local board of politicians who, for whatever arbitrary, non-rules-based reason, could find any reason to veto that construction. Is it any wonder that it is 4 times as expensive to build a railway in this country than it is in France? Is it any wonder that we build half as many homes every year in this country than the French do, with a smaller population than Britain? It's extraordinary that it's taken to this point, but I do think that this is the last great Attlee nationalisation project that the Conservatives need to take on. And it's embarrassing. It should shame everyone in the cabinet that it's the Labour Party now. It's the Labour Party that's talking about market reform. Rachel Reeves can't shut up about supply-side policy. She sounds like Liz Truss. How have we got to this point? And that's why business leaders are starting to talk about the Labour Party. It's not because they've all turned socialist. It's because in this area, the Labour Party started talking like they're Conservatives. Now, the big point of caution here is, do they actually behave like Conservatives when given half an opportunity? And I think anyone who saw that nutrient neutrality vote in the House of Lords will see that when it comes to the crunch, does the Labour Party actually live up to their rhetoric, or do they side with the blockers rather than the builders? But I think that's the prism through which we should look at this issue. What was done to curtail, cramp down, and really keep down the growth and potential of this country? What happened after the Second World War that tried to freeze this country and the level of development it was and just share around the money that we had back then rather than actually develop, build and grow more? And what can we do more to unpick that sclerotic settlement?
I think just coming in on Nathan's point there about how do we get young people to potentially start, either to stop them to start looking, I think that's the right way around, yeah, looking at leaving the country is, and I think the thing that people often forget is the fact that my generation, we saw our parents go through the recession. We were the ones that were sat there hearing them about them screaming at each other that they couldn't afford the mortgage. You know, we saw that the businesses went bust. We suffered. I know this is quite a fluffy analogy, but my best friend was moaning the other day how when his dad lost his job that they went down from 2 holidays a year to just 1. So, and then, you know, for example, Brexit happened and you have all these journalists telling us that we're all going to die and that the economy is going to crash and all these doom and gloom things. So it's no wonder that young people are actually looking to escape, because the thing is at the minute is that it's just so bleak. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, every party is having this problem. Like Tom said, Labour are coming out at the minute with more actual, probably conservative sound bites, I would call them, rather than policies. Because there is no policy there. No party is actually putting forward concrete policies for young people. So I think, you know, it is depressing, and how do we stop this is almost like reversing that depression and putting that kind of growth mindset back into young people. And it does kind of connect with this gentleman's question over here, in that how do we kind of bridge that gap between, you know, getting young people into the workforce ready after they've been to university or they've been to college, and you know, that is a lottery. It's either a postcode lottery of where you go to sixth form or college or school, and then it's also a lottery of where you go to university. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of sixth form colleges and schools don't necessarily encourage young people to look at anything else wider than the syllabus. And of course there are other great things that young people look at, like the nightlife, and where they will learn skills such as how to keep yourself safe, because we try and fail, which is actually quite a good thing. But the other thing is that some universities are very, very good at investing in careers, and they have fantastic career services and links in with the local community. Like, I went to the University of Liverpool, and much like Tom, got a little bit too involved in student politics. But, you know, and it's whilst you say, you know, do people actually gain anything from their degrees? In some very weird circumstances, when I went up and set up, when I went out there and set up the University Conservative Society in the most left-wing city in the UK, that actually landed me with the career that I've got today. And there are other people out there that, for example, you know, they go out to a sports team, they make their networks, they make their connections, and that is one piece of advice that I always give to younger people when I speak to them about their future, is, you know, go and make their networks. But yeah, it's a lottery, it's pot luck, and it shouldn't be lottery pot luck. So much like you said about let's make the universities go bust, you would probably have that little bit more of a competitive edge of what more do you offer other than just an essay and a piece of paper and maybe a 2-1 if you're lucky at the end of it.
Miriam, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and I think what young people are really looking for is meaning and purpose, and they feel like they haven't got meaning and purpose in this country, and I think that is tied to the fact that so many people stay in full-time education till they're 21, 22, 23, because work and responsibility give you meaning and purpose. And in previous generations, especially for boys, you know, getting to the age of 15 or 16, you're ready for some meaningful work. And I don't mean sat in a classroom learning algebra. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, there aren't benefits to more and more education. But, you know, my eldest is 15. And, you know, I think a couple of generations ago, he'd be in an apprenticeship by now and he'd be bringing in money. And there's something very dignifying about that kind of growing up. And you think, you're absolutely an adult by the age of 22. I mean, 100 years ago, you probably would have been married down the pit with 3 kids. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but, you know, you're absolutely ready for that kind of maturity. And yet we've got people leaving university never having done a day's work. That's not a good thing. And I think when you don't have responsibility and meaning, there's a tendency to start to think that it's someone else's problem. The BMA think the government have to fix it. The grass is greener. And I do think all these issues are tied together about, you know, just keeping people without responsibility for longer and longer. But, you know, back to the issue of the brain drain, and I think this ties into kind of policy around university as well. Our basic conservative principle is that the person who benefits from something should be the person who pays for it. So if the NHS wants to benefit from 30 or 40 years of a doctor or nurse working, well, they should pay for the training. And I think that if you commit to working in the NHS for 5 or 10 years, or whatever you say, they should pay completely for your training. If you've got an engineering company and you're struggling to recruit graduates or apprenticeships, you should pay for the training. You know, that seems to me a basic, fundamental point of conservatism. If you want to study, what shall I pick on that's not going to get me shot down? Journalism, for your own fun, then you should pay for it. Now, that's not to say there shouldn't be a reasonable way of contributing to that, but I think the problem is at the moment, you, as a medical student, you take on that debt at your own risk, and then you turn out it's not what you thought it was, and there's no benefit for loyalty staying in the NHS. But I do think it comes back to what is the meaning, you know, what's the meaning and purpose of a young person's life when they can't afford a home, when they don't have any responsibility, and I think those are the key things. If we could get kids at least into some sort of work experience from age 16, I think it would make a huge difference to their, you know, their sense of dignity and their sense of, you know, who they are and responsibility.
We've probably got time for one more quick one. Gentleman in the front here.
So my question goes back to the polling for 18 to 24s. I mean, that 1%, it shows how toxic the Conservative Party is. Like, people 18 to 24 are allergic to the Conservative Party. I mean, I am literally here incognito. I have friends who would probably fall out with me if they even knew I was here.
Can you take him out the YouTube video?
It's fine. So I suppose my question is, if this panel had sort of ultimate decision making over policy, what would be the one policy you would make to begin that sort of slow march against reversing that 1% polling for 18 to 24?
Brilliant question and a great one to round off on. So everyone, one policy that would secure justice for the young. Miriam.
Well, I think what's so interesting is that across the Western world, in every country but this one, there has been a populist movement that has included young people. this is the only country where it hasn't taken off. And I think that's because we've got first past the post and a two-party system. And so there's just no inroads for a new kind of movement. So I'm not going to say compulsory voting, and I'm not going to say PR, but there has to be some sort of reform that allows the young people's voice to come through. Otherwise, you know, politicians won't listen.
Interesting. Matthew?
I didn't want to go second because I haven't thought of one. There are so many. Well, going through the editing of the book, you know, and figuring out where the injustices of the current state are, I just came back to the conclusion that this is a society that's spending well beyond its means. So I think maybe it's not a policy, and I'm just going to cheat and answer a question I would have asked me. But I think that what we do need is a government that is unapologetically in favor of economic growth and is willing to make tough decisions and cut spending. And I don't mean, you know, cutting particular infrastructure projects. I mean entire departments have to be on the cutting block. We have to radically reform the pension schemes, and we have to tell a lot of old people that we're sorry, but we don't have the money. And I think we need a government that's brave enough to do a lot of that.
Thank you, Matthew. Liv?
So, I mean, we ask this question to our members, like, what do you actually want to see? And they will tick a box on numerous ones. And the ones that come up favourable every single time are lower national insurance rates for young professionals too. And certainly that might be a short-term fix at the minute just to help that little bit of money get into your pocket. But another one that's a massive favourable is lower tax zones in former industrial cities. A lot of my members say to me, I come from Middlesbrough, I come from Yorkshire way, I come from, you know, somewhere in Manchester, and just because of the way that the jobs are, you know, they're having to move to London. And this is still the case as much as there's of the work that's already been done with levelling up, as much of stuff there already is now in Manchester where we are. But the problem actually is that, yes, you can come and work in Manchester where there's a little bit more opportunity than there is in London, but because of the housing crisis, property prices aren't different, so it doesn't pay off, so you end up going to London anyway, because it just doesn't make much difference. So, and another thing that my members are really, really passionate about when pre-scrapping the tampon tax, you know, that's one thing that they said, but now also, you know, my members have got wind that now period clothing, such as knickers or swimwear, is still subject to a 20% rate of VAT. So there's a fantastic campaign going on at the minute to say pants to the tax, and I would fabulously run by Marks and Spencer's and an SME menstruation products company, and I would definitely say putting that one in there because my members are extremely passionate about that policy, about making sure that, you know, there is equality.
Pants to tax should have been the slogan, not long-term decisions for employees. Yes. Tom?
It's been done. It's been done before in this country. Margaret Thatcher at some points was polling first amongst young voters. It's been done perhaps most pertinently in the last 12 months in an English-speaking country that shares our king. Look across the water to Canada, where Pierre Poilievre is the Tory party leader. Now, he's not to everyone's tastes. He was someone that was seen as a bit brash, perhaps even a little bit culture-war-y, only several years ago. But he has been relentless with his focus and his message. And his message is simple. It goes after where the government gets in the way of people, particularly on housing. His slogan is "Bring it home." He talks about how the Trudeau government stops the development and how liberal cities in particular are incentivising away from building houses. But also he talks about inflation. And he talks about how money printing led it there. There was a wonderful speech he gave at the Conservative Party annual conference just last month, where he spoke about old copper nose, which was Henry VIII. Henry VIII's picture was on coinage, but they changed the coinage from silver to copper, just with a coating, because they were wanting to expand the amount of money that they were using. And you could tell that the worth of that money was less, that there was greater inflation. Because if you had these coins in your pockets and they were jangling around for long enough, the little bit of silver on the nose of Henry VIII would rub off, and he'd be known as Old Copper Nose. Now, Pierre Poilievre talks about another hereditary ruler of a country in that Mr. Trudeau, who perhaps should be known as Old Copper Nose. But one final story he also tells is about young people living in their parents' basements. Now, this is perhaps not something that many Conservative politicians would have been comfortable saying up until recently. But he says, how do you bring a girl home? How do you bring a girl home if you have to get past mum and dad? That ultimately is the positive populist message that Pierre Poilievre has brought to Canadian politics. There's an election next year, he will win it. He's polling streets ahead of Justin Trudeau, and it's a model for the British Conservatives to follow.
Thank you very much. That about wraps it up, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you to my panellists. That was a really fantastic discussion. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Everybody subscribe to CapX. It's the best daily email you'll get. Sign up for updates from the Centre for Policy Studies and enjoy your final night of conference. Thank you very much.